Welcome back to another episode of FPOG, Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals. This week on the podcast, we're excited to welcome Preston Holland to our podcast. What we want to talk about today is a little bit of an outside of the box topic. We want to dive into the world of private jets, private airplanes. So when it comes to private aviation, is this directly related to tax and estate planning for oil and gas professionals? Well, yes and no. It's a little bit of a tangent topic, but it also has a lot of overlap with our listeners and our niche. And so with that being said, Preston, welcome to the show. We're excited to have you.
Justin, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be able to sit here and have a good conversation about private aviation. You know, I think that the oil and gas industry is a big user of private aviation. It helps support hundreds of jobs across the state of Texas and across the world in private aviation. So I'm excited to kind of give a little bit of an insider view into what makes our industry tick, how our industries overlap together, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
I love that. That's absolutely right. Preston, if you don't mind, would love to just hear a little bit about yourself and how you entered the private aviation space.
Yeah, so my name is Preston Holland. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Flying Finance. We are an aviation finance company. Basically, we help individuals and corporations purchase aircraft and finance them in the acquisition process. I started out the way that I got into private aviation was I actually ran a magazine. So I ran a media business for about 2.5 years. I had a friend of mine said, "Hey, I'm buying Flying magazine," and we ran a private equity style roll up of about 28 different aviation titles over the course of about 2.5 years. And so I led the charge over there as chief operating officer. Was in charge of all of the day to day of the company and a lot of the integration. We had we still do have a strategy team, and we acquired an aviation finance business. And as a part of that transition, I was tapped by our executive team and our board to go kind of branch off and run that. I was, pretty well connected in the industry and, was ready kind of for the next adventure. And so moved over into that sometime last year and, have really been having a good time, getting to meet a lot of really interesting people from all different walks of life, kind of across the spectrum, helping them acquire airplanes and make that purchase.
That's very cool. And we will, in the show notes, we will link your X account. We'll link your social media so that our listeners can follow you. But Preston, you've been on a pretty significant rise recently. So I'm interested to just hear, so many more people are interacting with your content. What has this felt like for you? And what does it say about private aviation that what you're putting out there is so compelling?
Yeah, listen, Justin, it's pretty cool. I've been on Twitter for, gosh, I don't know, 5 or 6 years probably. I started out kind of tweeting business process stuff, and so I connected. I was blessed to interact with some pretty major accounts on kind of call it business Twitter early on, and before they kind of became these huge accounts. Chris Powers, who's there in Fort Worth with you, Fort Worth Chris, I think we followed each other. He had 3,500 followers. He's got 60 something thousand. Sweaty Startup is another one. It's funny. Everybody's like, "Oh yeah." I was like, "I know Nick. I've hung out with Nick before." Followed me when he had 20,000. He's got 330,000 followers now. But I tweet business process stuff and things I was thinking about. I actually was recruited to Flying based off of my Twitter account, which was at the time a 1,400 follower, call it super sub niche, tweeting about business process stuff. And when I started in this space, I tweet a little bit about what I did, in the private aviation space, and I'd tweet pictures of airplanes or whatever, and I'd start getting these DMs that were like, "Hey, I need a charter from the Northeast of Florida," or like, "Hey, I'm thinking about a fractional card. What should I be thinking about?" And the world of private aviation is so opaque. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's intentional by a lot of the actors. For instance, you can't find NetJets pricing on netjets.com. And actually, me as an individual inside the private aviation industry, I can't even get their sales reps to give me pricing. And I'm like, guys, I read a newsletter. Like, I have actual people considering swapping to NetJets. I can write about the pricing, and you're gonna have 5 or 6 people reach out. So I started as soon as I started tweeting the real cost behind private aviation, my account started blowing up. I had 1,800 followers in September of last year. I am about to cross 11,000 this month. And so, it's been meteoric growth. My one of the first tweets that I had kind of take off was, I basically tweeted about a $10 million business jet. I had an account reach out to me with 1 million followers and said, I thought that 45 million was kind of the get in price. I was like, well, yeah, if you want to get a brand new Gulfstream G650, yeah, that's the get in price. But there's a whole world of business and private aviation that exists. And the other thing is it's a taboo subject to talk about. You're not going to see. There are very, very, very large accounts that are on Twitter that I know their tail numbers. They own airplanes, but they have told me privately, look, I'm never going to tweet about my airplane, but let me tell you exactly what it unlocks for my business. And I kind of I collect some of those comments, and I say, look, this is what it means to fly private. This is, good experiences people have. This is bad experiences people have. And I started writing a newsletter. Gosh, it was funny. I was literally in the Delta Sky Club, which is an ironic place to start a newsletter about private aviation. You'd think like, oh, I was in the back of a private jet. And I literally tweeted out, I was like, hey, if I started a newsletter talking about private aviation, would you subscribe? And I had 45 responses in like an hour, everybody saying yes. And I went through and looked at the people who voted yes. And I'm like, okay, based off of what I know about their business, they actually probably are liquid enough or do have a business use case for private aviation. So I started writing it mostly so that when people send me a DM, I just have them an article to send to them and say, hey, just read this, as opposed to answering the same question. I was answering the same question 4 or 5 times a week. And so I, started writing that, and it's yielded some fruit for business, which is really cool. I mean, it's something that I don't think I expected early on, but I've been able to have conversations with private equity and family offices and CEOs of large roll up companies and large real estate developers. And so it's been a really cool journey. It's been a wild ride. I've really enjoyed it, and having the conversations with people has always been a lot of fun.
I love that. And I think you said something that is the secret of why your posts are so compelling. And that is, most people view this and it's this opaque industry and you don't really know anything about it. So the assumption is, I need to have the financial ability to spend $40 million on a jet. And if you are listening to this and you don't follow Preston right now, Preston, I love all of the different case studies you do where you just dive into, hey, this is, maybe this is a $10 million jet, but then you have endless threads on jets that are 3 million, 4 million, or just planes, single prop or double engine planes that are 800,000, 1 to 2 million. And so the get in price can be significantly lower than what much of the public realizes. And then you can, finance that over 10 or 20 years. And so that really leads into this topic of what exactly, when does the typical person begin to explore private jet or private plane?
When I talk to people, and I do free 15-minute subscriber calls for people who subscribe to my newsletter, but you kind of have call it the 50-hour and less. Everything in private aviation is measured in terms of hours, right? You don't buy an airplane ticket based off of how many miles you're going. You do it based off how many hours you're in the air, right? And fractions of hours therefore it's all on a basis of time. So if you're flying under, call it 50 hours or less, maybe, creeping into the 100 hours or less, it really doesn't make sense to own your own airplane when you look at kind of your all-in hourly cost by the time you pay hangar and insurance and maintenance and jet management and what have you. you're really going to net out, and charter one-off chartering, kind of on-demand chartering usually works out better for you. Maybe a jet card. I have my own personal opinion on jet cards that, most of it's a convenience thing. It's not really, you're not really saving money at the end of the day on a jet card. Then you have kind of fractional ownership. This is like if you ever hear somebody say my NetJet share, right? Or on my NetJet's plane or whatever, you buy a sliver of the airplane that gets you a certain amount of access flying around owner cost, maybe owner cost plus 20%. And then you have, so that's good for, call it 150 hours, 75 to 150 hours. After you cross over in 150 hours, sharing a jet, right? I helped a CEO of a pretty mid-major company, talking about him and another principal that he knew at another business. They shared, right? So they split it 50-50. All the fixed costs are split 50-50. They try and share it relatively 50-50, but pretty much whenever somebody needs to go, they go. So that's usually call it the 150 hour mark. If you're flying 300 hours or more, it's more cost effective, especially when you start talking about tax advantages and things like that, to actually own the airplane. So if you're flying 300-400 hours a year, you think about your large corporations, right? There's a reason why a lot of them own or have a corporate flight department, right? And they have an entire fleet of airplanes because those things are flying 400-500 hours a year, and so it just makes more sense from an hourly basis. But if you're talking about regularly utilizing private aviation, we're usually seeing net worth range somewhere in the $10 million range is kind of the starting point. But again, like you said, right? That's if you want to say the word jet, right? It's funny. I have these covers, and if you're watching on video, you'll see what I'm pointing to. If you're not, I'll kind of describe what it is. But this is a Vision jet right here, is on the cover of Flying Magazine. Get-in price on one of those is less than $3 million. You can get them on the used market for two and some change. And then these are, small single engine pistons that you can pick up for $200,000 or $300,000, kind of depending on how old you're okay going. And so the net worth range is very relative there, right? But you want to talk about, I'm going to buy a jet or I'm going to buy a turboprop, right? You're buying $1 million TBM 700 is a really good example for a Texas specific airplane. It's a fantastic use case for Texas. It's got a range of, call it 800 nautical miles, which means you can get anywhere in Texas, no stops. Four seats in the back, 2 seats in the front. So, you and a couple of others, can get somewhere quickly. You get into one of those for $1 million and some change. Those types of net worths, probably in the 6, 7, 8 million range. I mean, it just kind of depends on, this is not financial advice. And frankly, somebody like you, Justin, are more, apt to kind of give that advice of like how much of your net worth should you be spending if it's for personal, if it's business. The equation totally flips and inverts. But yeah, that's kind of what we see people getting into it. But it's not I have to have $100 million net worth before I ever even think about getting on a private jet. It's definitely not that.
Okay, that's super helpful. I am interested, obviously there's tax benefits. If you're a business owner and you're purchasing a plane, that can be a significant expense, and it could be an asset where depreciation comes into play. So there's a lot of moving parts on the tax aspect. Can you dive in a little bit on the kind of rentability charter aspect? So you purchase, let's say a $2 or $4 or $6 million plane or jet. How much are those annual costs going to be? And then how much in a best case or average case scenario can those be offset with chartering it out to others?
Let me explain to you kind of how the charter ecosystem works if you're an aircraft owner, and then we'll kind of back into some of the costs. So if you own an airplane, you put it on a charter certificate. I'll give you an example. There's a company based in Dallas, just down the street from you, called Leviate Air Group. They have a Part 135 certificate. They have an aircraft management division, and they will place demand into your supply, right? So they act as a broker, kind of as the in-between. And there is multiple layers of ecosystem here before you actually get to the owner of the airplane. So you have your charter brokers. They're going to charge somewhere between 3 and 7% premium to go source the supply for you. So you say, you call up your broker and you say, hey, I need to go from, Fort Worth to LA. I need to go on Tuesday and I need to bring 6 people. They say, okay, cool. Let me go get you a couple options. They go source the actual operator. In the event that something goes wrong, the advantage that you get with a charter broker like that, something goes wrong, it's on them. It's not necessarily on you. And so, so that's the first part of the ecosystem, and optional to use a broker or not. Then you have the aircraft management company. They actually hire the pilots for you, do all of the HR, kind of your outsourced flight department, right? We're talking about Walmart or Home Depot, Clayton Homes. They all have corporate flight departments to do all of that management for them in house. This is kind of your outsourced aircraft management group. So you pay them a flat monthly fee for those services. It can range from $6,500 a month just for the management to up to 20,000, kind of depending on the complexity of the airplane and a lot of those kinds of things. Then the next part of the ecosystem, right, is for them to actually fly your jet out on a charter, they take a revenue share. So different companies structure this a little bit differently. Some go lower flat fee, higher revenue share. Others do lower revenue share, higher flat fee. I always suggest to people take the ones that do the higher revenue share because it puts the incentive on them to actually put demand into your airplane. So there's call it an 80-20 split. That's pretty industry standard. So 80% goes to the owner, 20% to the management company. And then that's what the owner actually sees. Out of that, the owner has to pay fuel, maintenance, oil changes, right? Things like that, programs if it's on an insurance program, insurance, hangar space, etc. There is I don't know how your audience feels about TikTok or Instagram Reels, but there's a lot of really bad advice out there that says, "Hey, I fly my plane for free because it charters all the times that I'm not using it." If you think about that entire value chain that I just said, a $12,000 trip or a $12,000 per hour trip, the owner might see, if he's lucky, $6,500, right, an hour. And at $6,500 an hour, it's going to cost them about $3,500 an hour to fly it. So they're making $3,000 per hour of contribution margin. That's got to go pay for hangar insurance. Hangar fees are $2,000 a month a lot of times. So you got 24,000. So the quick math says I've got to fly 8 hours a year to pay for the hangar. I got to fly 20 hours a year for the insurance. I got to fly, and then the management fee. So out of the gate, I got to fly 10 hours a month just to cover my management fee and the split and the rev share and all that, right? So it's really, really, really challenging to make an aircraft cash flow or actually it's not even cash flow, it's contribution margin to be able to fly at some sort of a discounted rate. Your best bet is, if you're going to put your aircraft on charter, you may offset most, if not all of your fixed costs, depending on how much margin you can get, right? And then you're going to pay when you fly at cost. So maybe if it costs $1,800 an hour to fly your airplane, which is about what it costs to fly a CJ4, for instance, when you get on the airplane, you pay $1,800 an hour, and then everything else is covered. That's kind of best case scenario. You also want to pick what I call the aircraft that have, kind of this charter demand to operating cost spread. The demand's so high that you can raise the price, but the operating cost is low, that spread starts to increase. So the Citation XLS is a great example of that. It's really cheap to fly, but to charter it, it's a high dollar charter, and so that's a great airplane. The Lear 45 XR series, for what you can get in the open market on charter, it's relatively cheap to operate. So there's a couple of aircraft like that make sense.
What's the get-in price on those two aircrafts?
Get-in price on an XLS today is going to be 8.5 is the last one that I looked at. And that's going to be something a little older. Sub 10, most likely, unless you're going to get something that's pretty new. Lear 45 you can get into today for under 5. If you go a little older, 5.5, 6 is going to be market, right, for something that's got a lot of life left on it. So, it's not a $45 million G650 again, right? But it also doesn't cost, the 650 costs $4,500 an hour to fly, period. Don't care where you are, how much fuel is, right? So but those may be more palatable for a high net worth individual, right? That wants to offset some of their use of it with charter.
That makes a lot of sense. What would you say are the biggest innovations happening in private aviation over the next decade that you're most excited about?
For me personally, a lot of it's about propulsion, right? At the end of the day, you cannot break the laws of physics. That is the one thing that you cannot break. But your audience will be very familiar with propulsion technologies and what type of fuel are we using. Me personally, like, look, here's the deal. I am very pro oil and gas, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on an oil and gas product podcast, right? But I work in private aviation, right? Jet fuel literally fuels what I do, or 100 low lead, right? If it's on the piston side. And we still have leaded fuel. We're trying to get rid of it in the general aviation space, but there was some not great news that came out last week from a University of North Dakota study that they're going back to the lead. But I think sustainable aviation fuel is really exciting. Nestle, British Petroleum, World Fuel, a couple of those are kind of leading the way on that. I think the reality is, and this is something that we have aviation media, and everybody's rah sustainable aviation fuel. This is great. At the end of the day, like, there's like a fraction of a percent of overall jet fuel that's being produced as sustainable aviation fuel. So it's a bit press releasey right now, and to get the infrastructure to get there, and it's expensive. I mean, it is not less expensive to produce, and you know, that is a driver of inflation. So we need some innovation to happen in that space before I get totally bought in and say, hey, this is the ultimate end game for business aviation. I think a really exciting one for me is actually regional air mobility. So if anybody's at all familiar with kind of Joby and eVTOLs, and hey, we're all going to have flying cars and flying taxis. I mean, that I'm excited about that. I'm not even sure I'm 30 years old. I'm not sure I'm actually going to see it in my lifetime. Transparently, and definitely not at scale. I'm excited about regional air mobility and the combination of that and hydrogen powered mid, call it mid-range flights, right? So under 1,000 nautical miles, hydrogen powered. I don't think, never is a strong statement, but I very highly doubt we're ever going to cross any oceans not on jet fuel. I just, from what I understand about the physics, I just don't see it happening. But for, Fort Worth to Houston, that's a great use case for hydrogen, right? Because it's longer than the range of batteries. And here's a little bit of a tangent, but executives at oil and gas, this might be something that they might find interesting. Here's the problem, and the next time that you're at a country club and everybody's talking about electric propulsion, remind them of this: there are three forces of flight. There is lift, there is drag, and there is gravity. Right? Those are the three of the forces of flight. Gravity being a big component of that. What happens when you burn fuel? You get lighter. So you are producing thrust while simultaneously getting lighter over time. Electric batteries do not get lighter. It is a straight line. They are heavy if they're full, they're heavy if they're light. And as you hit the end of the power curve, at the end of the life of one of those batteries, you're actually exponentially decreasing the amount of thrust that you're able to produce because the weight hasn't lightened. So if you're flying in an airplane and you have half fuel tanks, and by the end you have an eighth of a fuel tank, you are lighter when you land than when you took off. That is, pretty basic math. In electric propulsion, that doesn't happen. And that may not be a big problem for cars, because if a battery dies in a Tesla, you just pull off to the side of the road. If the battery dies in your airplane, you hit the side of the road, but not in a way that you actually intended to.
That's an incredible point. So I want you to repeat something. Did you just say that an electric battery in an airplane could not even facilitate Fort Worth to Houston? That is a very small trip.
Yeah, look, we haven't seen a whole lot of them flying around, right?
Yeah, for good reason.
So, you haven't, if you look up overhead, you're not seeing a whole lot of electric powered aircraft going. In a perfect world, it's about an hour of flight time that you get. But, a lot of these manufacturers are quoting, right, we're going to go, downtown New York City to JFK. It's not very far, right? It's a whole lot closer than, Fort Worth to Houston. And that's where I think that hydrogen power comes into play, because you for the first time in aviation's history, you have we'll call it the recent history, right? 50 years. You have an opportunity for your cost of incremental thrust and incremental lift to decrease exponentially, right? Because hydrogen power, from how I understand it, and I am not an engineer, but from how I understand it, hydrogen power has an opportunity to exponentially get cheaper as we kind of figure out unlocks of how that propulsion mechanism works. And, you got to think in the same way with a car, right? Where you're turning wheels, we are turning a big blade in the air that's pushing air over it. So there is an opportunity to have an exponential decrease in the cost of lift, which is going to unlock these types of regional trips, call it 9 seats or less. And it's going to, if there's a chance to democratize aviation, Wheels Up likes to use that term a lot. Hydrogen, we have to get the cost out of the fuel. It is like the number one driver of cost when you're flying through the air. We have to get that cost down. And I don't see, and your listeners, if I would love to hear if this is going to be incorrect, but if we see an exponential drop off in the price of jet fuel, like the whole world economy is going to collapse, right? It's not going to be good for for oil and gas and all of that to exponentially drop. But if for those short trips, we do have the opportunity to have a replacement in the hydrogen space. That's where I think that there's a lot of really interesting, and the companies that I'm most excited about are focusing on that. They're saying, look, it's autonomous flight, yes, but it's short regional hops. I mean, I live in Chattanooga to Miami, in the grand scheme of things, not that far, right? But right now, a commercial airliner, I've got to go through Atlanta to go to Miami. If I'm on a jet, I'm going to be flying, hour and a half, 2 hours. But if I'm burning $900 an hour or $1,800 an hour worth of jet fuel, there's no chance that that's going to be unlocked to call it the everyday person. And that's what I'm most excited about personally, is kind of the regional air mobility, as somebody who doesn't have American Airlines in my backyard like you guys do.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate the kind words for oil and gas there. And it is funny how much attention headlines can grab, even though an alternative fuel source is maybe taking up just a minuscule, tiny fraction of what's actually necessary, which is, again, a reminder that oil and gas are miracle natural resources that have made life infinitely better for billions of people. Certainly, aviation is at the front and center of industries dependent on it. I'd love to pivot a little bit and just really get your thoughts, break it down for us in terms of how do you analyze whether it's better for someone to do net jets or actually buy an aircraft themselves and the responsibilities that go with that. And maybe part 2 of that question is, okay, you want to do, is it jet card? Is that the right term? And how do you compare kind of net jets, Wheels Up, and other alternatives?
Yeah. So, we talked earlier about what the profile looks like for the individuals who are doing that, but there are these overlap points, right? If you're flying 50 hours a week or 50 hours a year, don't buy an airplane unless you just really want one. 50 hours a year is not enough utilization, and that's 25 2-hour trips. That's not enough utilization to own the entire airplane by the time you talk about all those fixed costs. If you're not going to charter it, right? If you want to try and charter it, you're taking on some risk. What we see primarily, and I'll speak really quick to kind of the business owner, because you have kind of 2 personas, right? You have the individual, which for the individual, frankly, because there is no depreciation benefit and there is no kind of cost of trip write-off, right? It's an after-tax expense. Like 99% of the time, chartering makes the most sense because it gives you the most amount of optionality. Here's the other thing that I think is an interesting nuance to this question, and I haven't talked about this a lot on other podcasts, so this is an exclusive insight to your audience. But if you think about optionality and you think about protecting for future downside risk, right? So you're saying, okay, there is an odd in the future that everything crashes. There's an odd in the future that everything goes to the moon, right? And you're constantly thinking about what are those odds. If you own an airplane and you own it outright, you're paying those costs whether you like it or not, right? You're going to pay it next year if the grid goes out. Well, if the grid goes out, right? Probably a lot bigger problems than figuring out what's up with the airplane. But if the economy contracts by 20% because Jerome Powell gets crazy and says, "Hey, just kidding, no more interest rate cuts," and whatever, right? You have a future liability, and maybe the market resets, the airplane market resets, and now you're sitting in $5 million of real depreciation cost. That is cash depreciation cost. It's costing you a couple $100,000 a year. Guess what? In 2 years, tough luck, buddy, right? Like you're stuck with it. You're going to pay it whether you do or not. When you charter, it is a one-off transaction. You can cancel if you want to, right? You can charter today and say, I'm going to spend $40,000 in this trip, and tomorrow I'm going to go ride an economy, right? And done, right? So for individuals, I always suggest, look, you don't get any depreciation benefits unless it's something really sweet, like you and 5 or 6 other buddies are going to go in on a $3 million jet, and it's like, okay, worst case scenario, I still like to have the jet, right? That's not a downside risk. But if you're buying a 12, 15, $20 million airplane as an individual, like you're taking on a whole lot of risk with very, very few tax incentivized, structure to that purchase. So I usually suggest, if you're an individual, just charter. If you're a business, that's kind of where it gets a little different. Now, on a fractional program, I'll give you an example, right? So let's say, we're talking about, a company that has maybe 3 or 4 airplanes, and they're trying to decide between, I'm going to own 3 or 4 airplanes, or I'm going to get a NetJet share. You have some complexity around the concept of kind of the lead passenger, right? So you can only have a finite amount of lead passengers in a lot of these programs. So let's say, your CEO, COO, CFO all get lead passenger status. We only have 3 others. You have VP of leasing if you're in real estate, or VP of real estate development, right? That needs access. You can run out of kind of primary passengers in that situation. You're also kind of buying capacity at a premium, right? So you're going to pay a premium even if you're on a NetJet share. You're going to pay a premium. Now, that's why you wouldn't buy a NetJet share as a multi-member, unit. If it is just the principal flying, NetJets is a very, very viable option. If you have 8, 10, 12, 15 people that each need to be able to fly at any given time at the drop of a hat to go somewhere, NetJets may not be the right option for you, frankly, because it can be cumbersome to administer on your side. Yes, you have NetJets representatives, and yes, it's very nice. You have concierge service, all that. But if you hit halfway through the year and you go, wow, we've used up all of our hours, all of our time, you're going to come out of pocket for it, right? And that not great, right? So that's why you wouldn't. Why you would is it is stress free, hassle free. There is, relatively speaking, right? I've got a few clients and a few friends that all fly NetJets, and they're like, look, I pick up the phone, I say, here's where I'm going. The airplane shows up. The pilots are professional. They're nice. They get me to where I'm going. It's always safe. NetJets has never had a fatal accident, so there is some value in that. It just takes a lot of the stress off. I have a follower on Twitter that sent me a DM. She manages aircraft for her, husband's family office, family business. They own a Citation CJ3, and they have a Phenom 300 on order. And they've decided, we're done with this. We're dumping the airplanes. We're getting a NetJets card, and we're calling it a day, because they're tired of a lot of the hassle, right? You have aircraft on ground, and you have, if you're publicly traded, right, you have balance sheet liability. I mean, that is a real thing. If you are publicly traded, there is scrutiny. I heard a funny story that when Ford, during the automotive bailouts, Ford dumped their fleet of, I think, G450s and G550s into the market and bought a bunch of fractional shares. They ended up they were getting pressure. They were kind of getting fiduciary pressure from shareholders and activists saying, hey, why is Ford getting all this money from the government and they have all these jets? So they dumped them, bought a bunch of NetJet shares, and like tripled their corporate aviation expense. And it's like,
and it's harder to link back. It looks better publicly, even though it's a ridiculous decision.
Right, exactly.
And it's funny you mentioned that. We have a client who took a very similar path. Business owned planes, and then there's a situation where the main pilot eventually retires, and you get into this scenario where you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is all of the sudden the single most important decision that I'm going to make in the next 25 years. Who am I going to hire to fly my family? And the end result of that is, you know what? It's just easier to sell the planes and get a subscription service that just takes all of the responsibility off of our shoulders. I would love to end with this. It makes a lot of sense if you own a business. There's so many ways that you can approach this, and it's a little bit easier. But let's say that you're in a situation where you've been at a super major for 30 years, you're at kind of a VP or executive level, and you're heading into retirement with 20, $30 million. How would you tell someone like that to think about private aviation if they want to pursue private aviation?
Yeah, so it's funny that you mentioned that. I was at a conference about a year and a half ago with a CEO of a super major, and I didn't even frankly, I didn't even realize who he was when I was standing in the back of this conference room. And I looked over and I said, "Hey, how's it going?" And we started talking. And he said, "What do you do?" I said, "I work in private aviation." He goes, "Cool." And I looked at his name tag and I realized I look over, realize who he is, look at his name tag, and I was like, "Oh, okay, you know private aviation. You probably actually know it better than I do." And he said this. He said, "Look, I have had at my disposal for my entire professional life a fleet of airplanes that I can snap my fingers and I get on and I go anywhere that I want to in the world." He said, "I'm about to retire, and I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do when it comes to, travel." And he said for himself what he was going to do, because he's a, as most of these guys are, a good old boy who like to have fun. And he said, "I'm going to get me one of those SR-22s, the Cirrus SR-22s. I'm going to go learn how to fly, and I'm going to fly myself around. I'm going to enjoy retirement. I'm going to fly all around the Midwest and putter around." And he said eventually I might upgrade into a Vision jet. If that's your risk profile and that's your risk tolerance, it's a very viable entry point into aviation, right? You're getting price. You're going to pay about $1 million for an SR-20 and brand new SR-22. Oh, and by the way, you're going to wait like 18 months to take delivery of it. That's a bummer, but it's the nature of the beast. But you take delivery of one of those. What they cost less than $400 an hour to fly them. They're really cheap, relatively speaking, to fly. You can get most anywhere. If you live regionally, right? If you live in California, you want to get up and down the coast, easy. I don't know why you'd go retire in California personally. This is not tax or financial advice, but that seems like a backwards tax move. But hey, come to Tennessee, where we don't have state income tax. You retire here. I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I can, in an SR-22, I can be in Nashville, Charlotte, Atlanta, Tallahassee, Columbus. I can be in Milwaukee. I have done this trip in an SR-22, Chattanooga to Milwaukee in 2.5 hours. 3 hours if you get vectored around, right? So it's, it unlocks that for you if that's your risk profile. If not, if that's not you, if you're retiring and you say, "Look, private aviation is a way of life for me and my family. It's something that we've gotten used to." I'd look at a jet card subscription. I would look at, Wheels Up has been through some turmoil in the last 24 months. I would subscribe to Wheels Up or a program like it that services your area. Volato has a really good program on the Honda jet where you fly for, $5,000 or $6,000 an hour. And if you're doing it, 12 times a year to go see the grandkids or whatever, or go see kids at college, it's a really viable option for those people that have, some sort of wealth that they've accumulated. They've worked really hard, and, why not enjoy it a little bit?
That's fantastic. I love it. Well, Preston, thanks so much for coming on. And we're going to link your X or Twitter profile as well as a link to your newsletter. Is there anywhere else where people can find you?
Yeah, you can find us at flyingfinance.com. Really simple. That's the company that I'm with, flyingmag.com, aircraftforsale.com, avbuyer.com. We can link. We've got like 28 websites that we can link below if you've got the link capacity. But yeah, come if you subscribe to my newsletter. There's an option for a 15-minute free consultation that we jump on the phone, and basically for 15 minutes you can pick my brain, and it's worth as much as you pay for it, which is free. So it's free advice, but it's also worth about that much. But I can help point you in the right direction, help uncover some things for you, help frame some of your thinking if that's what you need. So looking forward to connecting with anybody and everybody. For the time being, I am very approachable. I think my DMs are starting to get a little cluttered, but I can usually pick out the people, the people that are worth the conversation. So.
Absolutely. Well, yes, I can endorse it. Wonderful 15-minute call, super helpful. And Preston, thanks so much for coming on the show. If you have any questions for us at FPOG or ideas for future episodes, send us a message. Thanks so much for listening.